Police received a frantic call. It was 37-year-old Jimmy Allen. Jimmy had just discovered his wife's body in the basement of their Michigan home. 18 minutes earlier, he had placed a 911 call. When the dispatcher asked what was going on, Jimmy said his wife was in the basement. He had pulled her up and tried to give her CPR. He told the dispatcher he had tried to help her. The dispatcher instructed Jimmy to continue giving Amy CPR while several units rushed to the scene. Officer Ben J. Horn was the first to arrive. Despite the desperation in Jimmy's voice during the 911 call, it was eerily silent as Officer Horn approached the residence. However, as soon as the officer made himself known, Jimmy began crying out for help. The officer called out, identifying himself as police. Jimmy responded with cries for help. Jimmy was found in the basement sobbing over his unresponsive wife's body. As he grieved, he continued performing CPR. The officer asked how long she had been down and if Jimmy had any idea. Jimmy said it couldn't be more than about 20 minutes. Oddly enough, Amy didn't have any significant injuries except for a very faint mark near her jugular. By 8:57 p.m., more officers arrived along with several EMTs. They piled into the basement to take over Jimmy's life-saving efforts. Now that Jimmy had a moment to process what was going on, he dramatically ripped his shirt off and broke down on the basement floor. He was able to quickly compose himself and continued to observe the EMTs aiding Amy. Jimmy alternated between complete composure and emotional outbursts several times. An officer asked if Jimmy wanted to come upstairs with him for a moment. Jimmy agreed. As shown in the footage, Jimmy seemed calm as he walked up the basement stairs. But as he entered the kitchen, he unleashed his rage onto an unsuspecting bowl of potato chips, violently knocking it over. The officers weren't sure what to make of this erratic behavior, especially since they had no clue what led up to the discovery of Amy's body. They asked if Amy had made any statements at all. Jimmy said no. Jimmy gave the officers a quick summary of his and Amy's night. At around 6:30 p.m., the couple dropped their daughter and her friend off at a nearby high school football game and then headed downtown for some drinks. While at a bar, they got into an argument and Amy ended up walking home alone while Jimmy drove home in their car. When Amy got back home, the arguing continued, so he left her alone to cool off. He went upstairs and put on the Jim Carrey film Ace Ventura. When it was time to pick up their daughter, he went to check on Amy again. Jimmy explained that he was irritated and didn't hear anything, so he went back down to check on her. Officers asked if Amy had a history of anything like this. Jimmy said nothing in her background at all. Ever. The officers found it strange that Amy would escalate things to this degree out of nowhere. But nobody seemed as shocked as Jimmy. He said he was literally hoping he would wake up from this nightmare. Unfortunately for Jimmy, this was a nightmare he wouldn't be waking up from. But suddenly, an EMT emerged from the basement with a glimmer of hope. He told the officers that Amy was fighting. The EMTs were able to reestablish a faint pulse, so Amy was still clinging to life. But when Jimmy realized that his wife was still breathing, he seemed frustrated by this promising news. His reaction immediately set off red flags for the officers. Jimmy then left the room momentarily to grab a new shirt. When he came back, he called his daughter Ashley to inform her of the emergency. He told her they had an emergency and not to go anywhere. There was an emergency, but he would talk to her in a little bit. Jimmy didn't want Ashley to panic over the phone, so he kept his composure and didn't share any details of what had happened. But right after that phone call, he called his parents and spilled his heart out. He told his mother he didn't know what to do. This was terrible. He had to talk to the cops. Although Jimmy was crying his heart out, the officer spotted no moisture on his face at all. They decided to have him wait outside, away from the crime scene. Shortly after, Amy was placed on a stretcher and taken to the back of an ambulance. They rushed her to the Pramadika Herrick Hospital just 2 minutes away. The EMTs were finished in the basement, so the officers headed back inside to do further investigation. Now that the dust had settled, they immediately noticed something strange. The basement ceilings were very low, so low that they began to question the logistics of Jimmy's story. Amy was 5 feet 6 inches tall, and the basement ceiling wasn't much higher, roughly 7 feet. But rather than jumping to conclusions, the investigators decided to wrap things up for the night. The next morning, Officer Horn and his partner returned to the Allen household to ask Jimmy some more questions. They hoped to get a better understanding of what led up to the incident. According to Jimmy, the family started their day in high spirits by making breakfast together and getting Ashley ready for school. He described how Amy was listening to music and making lunch and breakfast with a smile on her face. At around 7:30 a.m., Jimmy left for work and Ashley left for school while Amy stayed home. Jimmy decided to leave work early, so around 12:30 p.m. he came home and took a nap. Then at 2:45 p.m., the school day was over and it was time to pick up Ashley. Jimmy explained that Ashley had a friend over named Kayla after school. Amy picked her up while he was just in bed. They came to the house. Amy made everybody dinner. At 6:30 p.m., they all left to take the girls to the game. After a nice family dinner, everybody hopped in the car and drove to the Tecumseh High School for the football game. As mentioned before, Jimmy and Amy dropped off the girls and decided to head downtown to go bar hopping. They first went to Ember's Bar and Grill, then to JR's Hometown Grill and Pub shortly after. Investigators would later confirm this part of Jimmy's story by obtaining the security footage from JR's. Apparently, nothing seemed out of the ordinary until Jimmy brought up the idea of selling their house and moving down south, since the family had just moved to Michigan from Florida 1 year earlier. Amy was not fond of this idea. She began texting someone on her phone and became dismissive of Jimmy's comments. Jimmy said she said a couple of times that it wasn't going to work. She was normally positive but was sort of down and negative. She told him she hoped that worked out for him. He questioned what she meant. Just him? He was talking about their life. This wasn't hardcore planning. This was just talking about their future. But she just said she hoped that worked out for him. Jimmy said that this comment sparked an argument between the two. By the time they left the bar, things were very tense. Amy decided that she would rather walk home than sit with Jimmy any longer. This was also confirmed by surveillance footage, which captured Amy walking down the street, heading in the direction of their house. Amy arrived home at 7:58 p.m. She grabbed an extension cord and then went down to the basement. At 8:05 p.m., Jimmy decided to go check on her. Jimmy said she was petting Louis, one of their cats. He asked what she was doing in the basement. Apparently, Amy was angry at him for slamming the door in her face as they left the bar. But according to Jimmy, it was just an accident. He did forget to hold the door for her, but he didn't slam it intentionally. Amy didn't believe it was an accident, so she started throwing insults at him, and the two proceeded to argue for about 10 minutes. Nothing good was coming from this argument, so Jimmy went back upstairs, leaving Amy in the basement with the extension cord. About 25 minutes later, at 8:40 p.m., Jimmy realized it was time to pick up Ashley from the football game. Before he left, he went back to the basement to make peace with Amy. Jimmy said that when he glanced down there, he saw what looked like an upturned kitty litter pail. He immediately started checking for a pulse. He said it was just so sudden and unexpected. The officer asked if there were any signs that something like this might happen, but Jimmy said he could never have seen this coming. He explained that he had spent all night just thinking and playing back what triggered what. When asked if Amy had ever tried anything like this before, Jimmy said never. He described how they lived a healthy lifestyle. They worked out. They went rock climbing 3 times a week in Ann Arbor. They cooked meals at home. They grew their own vegetables. They had no money troubles. Jimmy emphasized that this was the pinnacle of his life, the best job he ever had. He made great money. Amy was a stay-at-home mom. She took care of the 5 cats, the pool, and was there for their daughter doing sports and activities. The officer then asked if he and his partner could do a more thorough search of the home, and Jimmy agreed. With the help of their new recruit, Louis, Jimmy's cat, the officers scoured every room in the household, hoping to find any clues that could explain last night's incident. They weren't able to find any major evidence, but they did collect several items that belonged to Amy, including her computer and cell phone. Following their search, Officer Horn headed back outside to speak with Ashley. She was visibly shaken up by the incident, but the detectives needed to know if Amy and Jimmy had a history of violent altercations. The officer asked if her mom and dad had been fighting at all yesterday that she could recall. Ashley said no, but everything was normal when she left. When asked if there was a history of them fighting or arguing or anything like that, she said nothing ever. The officer also asked about Amy's state of mind, but Ashley said that even though her mom was a deeply introverted person, she had always been emotionally stable. This interview wasn't as fruitful as the officers had hoped, but shortly after, they were approached by several of Amy's family members. They said that Jimmy had waited 14 hours to tell them about the incident. As soon as they heard the news, they rushed over to the police department because they had an abundance of useful information for the police. The investigators learned that back in 1997, when Amy was just 13, she had a son named Caleb. Her parents looked after Caleb while she attended high school in Ocala, Florida. By the end of high school, she began dating Jimmy, who had no problem becoming a father figure to Caleb. When Amy was 19, they had Ashley, and from that point on, Amy stayed home to take care of the kids while Jimmy worked. However, according to Amy's family, this wasn't her choice. They believed that Jimmy was a controlling husband who didn't want Amy to become financially independent. He would monitor everything the family did, from their social media activity to what they were eating throughout the day. He would also discipline the kids if he believed they were misbehaving, frequently taking things too far. Whenever Amy stood up to Jimmy, her opinion didn't seem to matter. Whatever Jimmy wanted, Jimmy got. So when Caleb turned 17, he left to stay with his grandparents. Jimmy retaliated, telling Amy that she was no longer allowed to speak with her family, including Caleb. One of the last times Caleb saw her was at his high school graduation a year before the incident. But other than that, Amy had minimal involvement in Caleb's life. All of this evidence was extremely damning for Jimmy. It wouldn't be a surprise if an abusive and controlling husband tried to murder his wife. But if the police wanted to build a strong case against Jimmy, they needed to answer one big question. What was Jimmy's motive? Unfortunately, before the investigators could answer this question, they received tragic news. On September 17, 2018, after being unresponsive for 3 days, Amy was taken off life support and pronounced dead. With a possible homicide now on their hands, the authorities pressed on with their investigation. They decided to look for answers in Amy's cell phone. In her texts with Jimmy, his controlling behavior was on full display. He had somehow been tracking Amy's every move. He would frequently text Amy her exact location and ask her why she was there. Despite all of Jimmy's torment, Amy seemed completely fine in her other conversations. This evidence strengthened the case against Jimmy. But the detectives still couldn't pinpoint an exact motive. That was until they looked through a conversation with a man named George. George was a married man from the East Coast that Amy had met online and had been texting for the past 3 years. Based on the explicit content of the messages, it was clear that they were having an affair. Even on the day of the incident, Amy and George were consistently texting and calling each other while Amy was having dinner with her family. At 5:07 p.m., George texted her saying he wished they could be together right now. At 5:29 p.m., Amy responded saying she was excited to see him again. Remember when Amy began texting somebody during the argument at JR's Grill and Pub? Turns out that she was texting George, even with Jimmy sitting directly beside her. From these findings, a new theory emerged. Perhaps Jimmy had caught a glimpse of these text conversations and was overcome with anger, which ultimately led to him attacking Amy in the basement. The investigators were eager to ask Jimmy some more questions, but they ran into a small problem. Jimmy was nowhere to be found. It turns out that just a few days after the incident, Jimmy and Ashley packed their belongings, including their 5 cats, and headed back to their hometown, Ocala, Florida, to stay with family. Thankfully, the authorities were easily able to get in touch with Jimmy to arrange another interview. He told them that he would be back in Michigan in a few weeks to grab some of his stuff. Since the Tecumseh Police Department had limited personnel and resources, the Michigan State Police had taken over the investigation, and Detective Larry Rothman was put on the case.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
1 month after Amy's death, Detective Rothman met Jimmy at the station for a formal interview. During his stay in Florida, Jimmy had plenty of time to reflect on his relationship with Amy, and he was forthright with the detective about his shortcomings. Jimmy said he wasn't so self-focused and inner-focused, and maybe he could have seen some things that were going on that could have clued him into what was happening. His life was in so much turmoil that he couldn't even see it. That's how it felt. He didn't even know who he was anymore. It was hard to believe this statement from Jimmy because moments later, when asked to describe himself, he gave an awfully detailed answer. The detective asked him to describe himself. What kind of person was he? Jimmy said he would say he was a type A personality. He liked structure and organization. He was ambitious. He was always seeking to improve himself and others around him. That's why all this was so pressing to him, because he had really taken measures in the last couple of years to make sure that himself and his family were mentally fit, mentally healthy, pursuing things that not only got them physically fit but also helping others, being kind, making a positive impact on people. Without a doubt, Jimmy's obsession with creating the perfect family was immensely toxic. However, Jimmy seemed to take pride in this toxic behavior, framing it as a strength. He believed that his role in the family was to hold them to a higher standard. No matter how much Jimmy painted himself as an upstanding family man, the detectives weren't buying it. The detective asked Jimmy, looking back now to where he was at, if anything popped out at him. Jimmy said yeah, his wife had some issues. When asked what kind of issues, he explained she struggled with social anxiety. She had been like that for years, an extremely shy, introverted person. She never developed relationships anywhere in Ocala. She didn't have any friends. She was playing video games compulsively, that World of Warcraft thing, and it got out of hand. So she just sort of started isolating herself. Jimmy said he had taken measures when they got to Michigan to help her break out of it. Jimmy was painting himself as a valiant savior, guiding his wife away from her bad habits towards a healthy lifestyle. But as mentioned earlier, everybody who was close to Amy said that Jimmy was the main cause of her isolation. While asking Jimmy about infidelity in the relationship, he revealed that Amy wasn't the only one cheating. He admitted there was one time when he went to the Isle of Palms and hooked up with a woman. The detective asked if at any time during his marriage, Jimmy knew if Amy was unfaithful to him. Jimmy said he didn't think that would be possible. When asked why, he said she didn't seem to have the capacity to talk to people. She was incredibly introverted. Clearly, Jimmy underestimated Amy's charm. Later in the interview, the detective set the record straight, bluntly telling Jimmy that Amy was in fact having an affair. He asked what Jimmy's knowledge was of her affair. Jimmy said he didn't think she had an affair. He had no idea. He wouldn't think it was possible. The detective said there was a lot of stuff that Amy had tried to delete, but they were talking about her telling this other guy she loved him. The detective said he thought Jimmy was lying to him, but he wasn't going to lie to Jimmy, and he hadn't. Jimmy said he would just tell the detective right now he didn't believe it. Jimmy seemed to be in denial. So the detective printed off some excerpts from Amy's conversations with George, some more explicit than others. He showed Jimmy how the chats led up to the 14th, the same day that this happened. Clearly, there was something going on between these two people. As someone who had a say in every aspect of Amy's life, Jimmy seemed completely blindsided by her secret life with George. He wanted more answers. He asked if they could pull phone records to see if there were any numbers he didn't recognize. That was crushing to him, to think that she even had something like that. He legitimately still didn't all the way believe them. He was sorry, but he didn't think she had the capacity to do that. This was the most shocking process for him. In a last-ditch effort to get a confession, the detective asked Jimmy if he would take a polygraph test. Jimmy agreed and maintained his innocence the entire time. Ultimately, the test results were inconclusive. The detective wrapped up the interview, less certain about Jimmy's involvement than before. Jimmy was allowed to leave and he went back to Florida later that day. The police struggled to find any new leads, So they had no choice but to wait for the medical examiner to release Amy's autopsy report. That day finally came 3 months after Amy's death. It was confirmed that the cause of death was strangulation asphyxiation, but the manner of death was undetermined, requiring additional investigation. The ball was back in Detective Rothman's court, but finding more evidence to determine whether or not this was a homicide was easier said than done. He meticulously looked through all of the evidence, including the body cam footage. He stumbled upon the moment that Officer Horn noticed how low the basement ceiling was, and he suddenly had an idea. Rothman reached out to a forensic engineering lab in Michigan and asked them to recreate the scenario Jimmy had supposedly stumbled upon. After many months of preparation, testing, and analyzing the results, the lab determined that under the same circumstances, her feet would have made contact with the ground. A different forensic pathologist reviewed the same test results, and they determined that her manner of death must have been a homicide. On October 16, 2020, Jimmy was charged with 1 felony count of open murder. This meant that if the case went to trial, it would be up to the jury to determine the degree of homicide Jimmy was guilty of, anywhere from involuntary manslaughter to first-degree murder. By this point in the investigation, it appeared that Jimmy, who was still staying with his parents in Florida, had moved on entirely. In fact, he even had a new fiancée, and their wedding was just 5 days away. But before they could tie the knot, Jimmy was arrested and extradited back to Michigan. Once he was booked into jail, he was brought into a room to have his charges explained to him. When told that he could contact the investigators if he had any questions, Jimmy said something peculiar. He asked if this was how they slept at night. The officer said he didn't understand that question. A few weeks later, at his arraignment hearing, Jimmy pleaded not guilty. His bond was set at $10 million and he was put behind bars. Leading up to his trial, his defense attorney, Daniel Guerin, released a statement. It said that Mr. Allen vehemently asserted his innocence in this case, as he had absolutely nothing to do with Amy Allen's tragic death. He cooperated with police throughout the 2-year investigation and provided evidence and statements showing his innocence from the very beginning. He had been in jail for nearly a year for a crime he did not commit, and he missed his family dearly. He was looking forward to the evidence finally being shown to a jury of his peers so they could see clearly that he was innocent and did absolutely nothing wrong. In September 2021, 3 years after Amy's death, his trial began. Prosecutor Angie Borders kicked off the opening statements. She said that her team was confident that the evidence would point the jury to a guilty verdict. Defense attorney Daniel Guerin delivered the defense's opening statement, saying that there was no substantial evidence to support the prosecution's theory, and their case did not add up. He argued that the people wanted the jury to believe that Jimmy Allen, for reasons nobody explained or guessed or understood why, snapped after 15 years of marriage, brutally killed his wife, went into cover-up mode, did all of this cover-up, and then called the police at 8:52 p.m. to start showing them evidence of this hanging. They also pointed to Jimmy's search history that night, suggesting that murder was the last thing on Jimmy's mind. The phone searches they obtained from Jimmy's phone showed that he was looking at searches for Jim Carrey movies and other Showtime shows. The exact shows that he had told police that night that he had watched. One of the key witnesses for the prosecution was Amy's son, Caleb. He told the court about an altercation with Jimmy while he still lived at home. He described how he stood up and pushed Jimmy against the wall. There was a second of fear that came over him, and he realized what he was doing and let up. Then he was spun around, or maybe he turned around, and then he was choked from behind on the floor for multiple seconds. It felt like forever during the incident. He was gasping for air, grabbing for anything, trying to get away from Jimmy. This story suggested that Jimmy had a history of choking people when he got angry. If he was willing to choke Caleb, it was reasonable to assume that he was willing to choke Amy as well. Several witnesses who were at the scene that night were also called to the stand, including first responders and neighbors. They all testified that Jimmy's over-the-top reactions seemed like he was putting on an act. Jimmy's behavior throughout the body cam footage supported this. There were several moments where he would be sobbing uncontrollably, saying this was terrible, but would instantly compose himself to answer the officer's questions, saying he had to talk to the cops. On top of Jimmy's questionable behavior, Officer Horn also noted that Amy's injuries did not align with Jimmy's story. He explained that he was definitely looking for any injuries, whether from a hanging or otherwise. He really didn't see any sort of the typical injuries that he normally would have seen in a hanging. So he definitely took note of that. Later in the trial, a hospital staff member who treated Amy agreed with Officer Horn's observations, saying that the lack of external injuries suggested foul play. When asked if there were visible injuries, the staff member said no. When asked if that struck them as odd, they said it was a red flag. One witness that nobody expected was none other than Mystery Man George. When asked if there was an occasion where he came to know somebody on the internet, he said yes, they spoke online often. They talked about life, but there was also a little bit of sexual content in what they talked about. For the most part, George and Amy communicated through text and video calls, but the more they got to know each other, the more eager they were to see each other in person. When asked if he had ever met Amy in person, George said yes, twice. The first time the two met up was in spring of 2017 to grab some coffee. The second time was several months later when Amy met George in a hotel room. When asked about being at a hotel, he confirmed yes. When asked if things that happen at a hotel happened at that hotel, he said some things, yes. Apparently, George and Amy's love for each other only grew as time went on. Even on the day of her death, Amy showed no signs of wanting to slow down. George described their text exchange. He wrote that he loved her and wanted more of her. She wrote that she loved him too and was ready to spend time with him in person. He wrote back asking when, and she wrote end of October. He responded that he was in. Dr. Elizabeth Buck also played a crucial role in the prosecution's case. During her testimony, she took the jury through the extension cord experiment mentioned earlier. The first question that Detective Rothman asked was whether an extension cord could suspend 140 pounds. The testing was performed. The answer was no. According to the prosecution, the results of her tests were more than enough to disprove Jimmy's story. When it was the defense's turn to call witnesses, they had Jimmy's father testify. According to him, Jimmy didn't flee the state because he was guilty. It was because Jimmy's family urged him to stay with them in Florida. He described Jimmy as somewhat composed but totally shattered, almost empty. He had never seen him like that before or since. He was almost non-responsive. He seemed to have lost interest in anything. Ashley also testified on her father's behalf. The day after the incident, she had said that her mother had always been stable. But now, 3 years later, her story had completely changed. When asked if she noticed anything from her vantage point that was a problem, behaviors or issues she saw when her mom was drinking alcohol, she mentioned two things. Her mother overindulged in alcohol frequently and became intoxicated very easily and frequently as well, which would cause her to not be herself at all. She would be meaner and more violent. When Amy was placed under intensive care, her blood alcohol content was recorded at 0.09%, likely caused by the 2 or 3 drinks that she consumed at the bars that night. The defense said that this was proof of Amy's drinking problem and that she wasn't as happy as the prosecution had suggested. The defense also questioned the forensic pathologist who claimed that this was a homicide. To dispute this notion, the defense had actually reached out to their own expert, Dr. Francisco J. Diaz. According to Dr. Diaz, since there was minimal bleeding to the strap muscles of the neck, no petechiae, small red spots caused by broken blood vessels, and no evidence of defensive-type injuries, he believed that Amy's death was not the result of somebody else's actions. The defense had called all of their witnesses, but they had a lot more to say in their closing arguments. They said that the prosecution's case was complete speculation, and the fact that Jimmy had 0 defensive marks on him was proof of that. The defense argued that if anyone puts you in a chokehold, you're going to scratch them badly because you're fighting for life. You're fighting for that air hunger and you're trying to stay alive. They also said that even though Amy and George's relationship seemed to be flourishing, it was actually just a fantasy, an escape from the dejected state of mind that plagued Amy's life. The defense emphasized that the people wanted to say this was something she was looking forward to break free. But it was 3 years, and they had 3 years to meet, and they met one time for 2 hours. Amy was not talking to her family. She was isolated. She didn't have a job. She was socially anxious. And that was not to criticize Amy Allen. It was to tell the jury that she was living a double parallel life. The defense concluded by saying they believed the fuse was lit. Unfortunately, isolation, drinking, odd behavior, and the guilt of a very graphic and long-term affair unknown to Jimmy and their daughter ultimately led to her very sad and tragic death on Friday, September 14, 2018. Both sides rested their case. Jimmy's fate was now in the hands of the jury. After about 6 hours of deliberations, they had their verdict. The jury foreperson announced that upon their oath, they found the defendant guilty of the lesser offense of second-degree murder. After this verdict, Jimmy didn't seem to know what to do with himself. He wandered aimlessly for a bit, and when it was time to be booked into the jail, he bashfully waved goodbye to his family. On October 21, 2021, Jimmy was sentenced to 20 to 45 years in prison in the Michigan Department of Corrections. He currently resides at the St. Louis Correctional Facility and will be eligible for parole in the year 2040. Every crime leaves a trace, and we're here to follow them. Subscribe for more real, haunting stories you won't forget.